senior North Korean officers have reportedly moved to the front lines in Russia, according to South Korea's intelligence agency. President Yoon shared information with NATO and spoke with his Ukrainian counterpart Zelensky over the phone, given the gravity of the matter. The U.S. has finalized curbs on American investments in Chinese chips, AI, and quantum computing, citing security concerns. With the election just 7 days away in the U.S., Harris and Trump continue exchanging denunciations and clash over a range of issues, among which is a chip subsidy bill. It's October 29th, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We start with details from a briefing to lawmakers by intelligence officials who touched upon the likelihood of North Korean generals being deployed to front lines in support of Russia's warfare against Ukraine. They suggest many of dispatched troops appear young. Our correspondent Kim Jong-un has the latest.
The National Intelligence Service has provided an update on North Korea's troop deployment to Russia. In a closed-door briefing to the National Assembly Intelligence Committee on Tuesday, the NIS reported on ongoing troop transfers to Russia, including the potential movement of senior officers to the front lines. The NIS also gave details particularly regarding soldiers seen in recent videos. Lee Sung-kwon, People Power Party Vice Chairperson of the National Assembly Intelligence Committee, explained that in North Korea, military service begins at the age of 18. He added that some of the soldiers deployed to the Storm Corps are in their late teens, while most are in their early 20s. He added that although they may appear young, these soldiers have undergone the required combat training for their roles. Therefore, their combat capabilities should not be underestimated. The Storm Corps is known to be one of North Korea's elite special forces units. However, the NIS pointed out that the unfamiliar terrain of modern warfare, as seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, presents challenges for these North Korean troops who lack experience in such conflicts. The officials then added that it's still hard to tell the exact number of troops being moved to the Kursk region, but that the total number of deployment is being estimated at around 10,900. The NIS also disclosed that Russian forces have been teaching over 100 military terms to North Korean troops, terms such as on your mark and fire. However, reports indicate communication problems as many North Korean soldiers are struggling with the Russian language. The NIS also warned of possible upcoming provocations by North Korea.
North Korea is preparing to launch a new reconnaissance satellite, reportedly resolving technical issues from a failed attempt in May with assistance from Russia. While the situation remains fluid, there are indications the North may consider its seventh nuclear test after the U.S. presidential election.
North Korea and Russia are reportedly also ramping up economic cooperation, especially in minerals, with covert deals likely to bypass sanctions after signing a new partnership treaty in June. NIS estimates that over 4,000 North Korean workers have been sent to Russia this year. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
Seoul and the West share related information as they continue to closely monitor the military collaboration between Pyongyang and Moscow. Washington warns of consequences if troops enter combat. Woo Soo-young has this report.
South Korea and the United States say North Korea has sent at least 10,000 troops to Russia to fight in Ukraine, as NATO also warns the soldiers could quickly advance to the front lines of the biggest conflict in Europe since the Second World War. On Monday, Pentagon spokesperson Sabrina Singh said Pyongyang has sent about 10,000 troops to Russia to train and fight in Ukraine within the next several weeks, a significantly higher number than the 3,000 estimated by the White House last week. Singh said some North Korean troops have already moved closer to Ukraine, appearing to head for the Kursk border region, where Russian forces have struggled to push back against the Ukrainian incursion. She also said if the troops enter combat, there would be no limits on the use of US-provided weapons. The spokesperson's remarks came just hours after NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that some North Korean units were already in the Kursk region, deeming the development a significant escalation. Rutte had been briefed by a South Korean delegation of military and intelligence officials in Brussels, who said the deployment of North Korean soldiers has been speeding up, with Kim Jong-un, a high-ranking army official close to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, also sent to Russia. The first deputy director of Seoul's National Intelligence Service, Hong Jang-won, said since the disclosure of North Korea and Russia's military cooperation, it appears the two sides are working impatiently to move an estimated 12,000 troops, with some already dispatched to the Kursk region. President Yoon Suk-yeol on Monday held a phone call with the NATO Secretary General, saying he hopes NATO will strengthen its solidarity with Seoul and increase efforts to monitor and block illegal exchanges between Pyongyang and Moscow. Rutte thanked the South Korean leader for swiftly sending a delegation of military intelligence officials to brief NATO member states on the situation and expressed hope to keep sharing battlefield-related information and coordinate response measures. Yoon also talked on the phone with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, warning North Korean troops could move to the front lines at a swifter pace than anticipated. He called for the immediate withdrawal of North Korean troops and an end to the collaboration between Pyongyang and the Kremlin, warning that South Korea would actively implement countermeasures. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned North Korea may soon have as many as 12,000 soldiers in Russia and called for weapons and a clear plan to prevent North Korea's expanded involvement. So far, Russia has neither directly confirmed nor denied that it is hosting North Korean soldiers, but has said it is up to Moscow and Pyongyang on how they implement their new security treaty reached in June. The US Pentagon says the North Korea-Russia axis is likely to be discussed when South Korean Defense Minister Kim Jong-un meets his US counterpart Lloyd Austin on Wednesday in Washington, D.C. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
And South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol today held phone talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss the involvement of North Korean military forces in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. According to the presidential office, Yoon said that South Korea will not sit idly by Pyongyang and Moscow's military collusion and vowed to take effective step-by-step response measures. Yoon also warned of the dangers that may arise from North Korean soldiers' real war experience gained through the war in Ukraine. Zelensky said the two sides agreed to strengthen intelligence and expertise exchanges and intensify contacts at all levels, especially the highest, in order to develop countermeasures and an action strategy and to address the escalation. North Korea's top diplomat, meanwhile, is in Russia amid mounting international criticism over the regime's deployment of troops to aid the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
North Korea's foreign minister, Choi Sun-hee, has visited Moscow for the second time in 6 weeks. The North State media KCNA said Tuesday that she left Pyongyang International Airport on Monday without further elaborating how long she'll be in Russia or the purpose of the visit. Choi visited Russia last month to take part in a global forum, and she also traveled to Moscow in January, where she met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. South Korea's intelligence agency said in a parliamentary session on Tuesday that Choi is believed to have held talks on sending more troops to Russia.
North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee went to Russia on Monday, October 28th. The National Intelligence Service believes there were follow-up discussions regarding additional troop deployment and reciprocal measures, so it's utilizing all available resources to find out the details of these talks.
Experts also say that Choi likely discussed or plans to discuss the specific details of North Korean troops in Russia, such as where they'll be stationed, what they will get in return, and how Pyongyang and Moscow will jointly respond to criticism from the international community. And it's widely believed that she's expected to hold talks on Kim Jong-un's possible visit to Moscow to meet with Putin.
Since Putin visited North Korea in June, Kim Jong-un will likely visit Russia in return. And if that's the case, Kim's visit to Russia could happen in the first half of next year, after the U.S. presidential election. So it's likely that the North Korean foreign minister will have candid discussions on these issues.
Last week, Kremlin spokesperson said there is a possibility that Kim Jong-un could visit Moscow next year, noting that high-level exchanges are always taking place with Pyongyang as its close neighbor. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
The NIS underlines that the North is beefing up its security for leader Kim Jong-un against possible assassination attempts. Meanwhile, his daughter's status appears to have been elevated as well. Choi Min-jung with the details.
North Korea appears to be raising its level of security in anticipation of a possible assassination of its leader Kim Jong-un. During a parliamentary audit on Tuesday, the National Assembly's Intelligence Committee announced the National Intelligence Service's recent findings.
Kim Jong-un's public activities this year have increased by 110 times, or about 60% compared to last year. And North Korea has been raising its security level by operating communications jamming vehicles and drone detection equipment in anticipation of possible attempts to kill Kim Jong-un.
Meanwhile, the NIS also believes that the status of Kim's daughter, known as Kim Ju-ae, has recently been upgraded after being spotted being accompanied by the North Korean leader's powerful sister Kim Yo-jong, as well as the regime's foreign minister.
Kim Ju-ae has been escorted by Kim Yo-jong and assisted by Choi Son-hee, partially elevating her status.
The elevated status comes amid growing speculation that Kim Ju-ae will succeed Kim Jong-un. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The U.S. has hammered out a final framework of restrictions on American investment in Chinese advanced technology. Lee Soo-jin covers the implications of these measures for Korea and more.
The U.S. government's new investment controls targeting China are expected to have a limited impact on the South Korean economy. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy announced in a statement on Tuesday that this was because the rules that aim to restrict American investment in advanced technology in countries of concern only include mainland China and the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. The rules finalized by the U.S. Treasury Department on Monday local time restrict American transactions involving advanced technology, such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing that could threaten U.S. national security. The rules, which will take effect on January 2, 2025, are designed to implement President Joe Biden's executive order signed in August last year. The regulations aim to prevent China from enjoying intangible benefits that are believed to come with U.S. financial support, including enhanced standing and prominence, managerial assistance, investment and talent networks, and market access. Noting that advanced technologies are fundamental to the development of next-generation military surveillance, intelligence, and certain cybersecurity applications, Assistant Secretary for Investment Security Paul Rosen said the Biden-Harris administration is committed to keeping these out of the hands of those who may use them to threaten U.S. security. The Treasury is also setting up a global transactions office to oversee the new rule, and violators will be fined up to around $368,000 or twice the value of the prohibited transaction, whichever is greater. Moving forward, the South Korean government pledged that it will analyze the impact that the rules have on the economy from various angles, by closely communicating with domestic businesses and experts. One expert echoed the government's assessment of the impact that it will have on Korean companies.
So I think everybody expected the strengthening of restrictions, and most Korean firms, I think, have prepared for this, so they would not have too much problems.
He added that these rules nevertheless indicate that domestic companies will have to be more mindful of exports they make to China in the future. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
As campaigning becomes fiercer in the U.S., Kamala Harris has denounced comments made at a Trump rally by a participant who degraded Puerto Rico. In the meantime, the two candidates show differing views on providing chip subsidies. Cha Yun-kyung brings the latest.
U.S. Vice President and Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris has blessed the comments made at a New York Trump rally on Sunday, disparaging Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage.
And that's why people are exhausted with him. That's why people who formerly have supported Donald Trump, have voted for him, are supporting me, voting for me.
Donald Trump's campaign says the comments did not reflect the former president's views. As campaigning gets fiercer between the two candidates, the race remains neck and neck, with poll results among registered voters nationally showing a 1 percentage point gap within the margin of error of 1.3%. According to analysis by 538, national polling shows 48% of voters support Vice President Kamala Harris and 46.7% support former President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, during an interview, former President Trump criticized the Chips and Science Act, saying he will impose high tariffs on foreign companies who invest in the U.S. so that they will come and build semiconductor factories for free. This means that Trump would use tariffs to compel foreign semiconductor companies, such as Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and TSMC, to build factories in the U.S. instead of providing subsidies. On the other hand, Vice President Harris visited Michigan-based manufacturer Hemlock Semiconductor, where the Biden-Harris administration provided proposed direct funding of $325 million made under the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act. Vice President Harris' visit to Michigan reflects the administration's support for battleground states, known as Bidenomics, focusing on the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. 차윤경, Arirang News.
In the Middle East, Israel is banning a UN relief agency for Palestinian refugees from operating in its territory, as well as in areas under its control. Ian He explains.
On Monday, Israel's parliament passed a bill banning the United Nations Relief and Works Agency from operating on Israeli territory and areas under Israel's control. The UNRWA, providing life-saving services in war-torn Gaza, was established in 1949 to provide humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in a statement about the legislation, reiterated his claims that UNRWA employees are involved in Hamas-related terrorist activities. In response, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed deep concern, stating there is no viable alternative to the UNRWA, warning that the legislation could have devastating consequences for Palestinians. The legislation is set to take effect in 90 days, further jeopardizing an already strained aid distribution process for Gazan civilians. The UNRWA's former General Counsel said on Tuesday that Israel's move represents a broader attack on the UN system, calling for a strong response. The move has also drawn worldwide condemnation from countries including Australia, Belgium, Jordan, Ireland, Norway, Slovenia, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK. World leaders have described it as intolerable, illegal, and nothing less than collective punishment. This decision by Israel comes despite U.S. State Department concerns that there's no substitute for the UNRWA amid the ongoing crisis, and a statement from foreign ministers of 7 countries, including South Korea, opposing Israel's actions. Meanwhile, Israel's attacks in Lebanon are intensifying. According to Lebanon's health ministry, at least 60 people were killed in Israeli strikes on Monday night across 12 areas in Baalbek, eastern Lebanon, including 2 children. Nearly 60 others were reported injured. The Israeli military's offensive in Gaza continues, with reports of at least 7 Palestinians killed in northern Gaza and 10 in the central region. Additionally, reports stated that the Israeli military set fire to a school run by the UNRWA in the Zabalia refugee camp. Since the onset of the Middle East conflict, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 43,000, while in Lebanon it has exceeded 2,700. Ian He, Arirang News.
Today, October 29th, marks a grim anniversary in Korea. 2 years ago, more than 150 lives were lost during a crowd crush at an alley in Seoul's Itaewon district. Now, in memory of the victims, a solemn ceremony was held at the parliament. Our correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
It's been 2 years since the unimaginable tragedy in Itaewon, where a crowd crush resulted in the loss of 159 lives. To remember those who perished, lawmakers gathered at the National Assembly on Tuesday, along with about 120 family members of the victims of the disaster. This is the first time the Assembly has officially hosted a memorial ceremony for a humanitarian disaster.
Protecting victims' rights, uncovering the truth, and preventing tragedies are essential steps toward creating a better future. The National Assembly is committed to leading this effort.
Along with the photos of the victims, the walls of the venue displayed a message that said, "We still have names to remember. We will not forget the 159 who tragically lost their young lives." Other memorial ceremonies took place across the nation, including in front of Itaewon Station, to offer prayers for the victims and condolences to their families and survivors. Meanwhile, during a cabinet meeting the same day, President Yoon Suk-yeol emphasized the importance of reviewing crowd safety measures.
안타깝게 돌아가신 분들의 명복을 빌며 슬픔을 안고 살아가시는 유가족분들께도 깊은 위로의 말씀을 드립니다. 관계 부처는 클라우드 매니지먼트를 비롯해서 다중 안전 체계를 점검하고 보완하는 데 만전을 기해 주기 바랍니다.
신하영, 아리랑 뉴스.
On the baseball ground, the Kia Tigers beat the Samsung Lions Monday evening to win their 12th Korean Series title. Lee Seung-jae has the highlights.
Going into Game 5 of the 2024 Korean Series on Monday, the Kia Tigers had never lost a championship series, with 11 out of 11 previous Korean Series appearances ending in victory. After Monday night's game, Kia made it 12 for 12. Down 5-1 at one point in the game, the Tigers stormed back to beat the Samsung Lions 7-5 to win their first KBO League title since 2017. What made Monday's win even more special was that the Tigers were able to clinch the title in front of a sold-out home crowd for only the second time in their 12 championship wins. The Gwangju-based team now becomes the first professional baseball team to win a Korean Series title in 5 different decades: the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and now 2020s. While the Kia Tigers boast some of the best power hitters in the league, it wasn't the power hitters that helped them to victory. The 165-centimeter infielder Kim Sun-bin was named the Korean Series MVP after going 10 for 17 in the 5 games. He beat his teammate Kim Tae-gun 46-45 in media voting. While the Kia Tigers' 2024 season started off with their manager Kim Jong-un getting fired over a bribery allegation, Lee Bum-ho, a Kia Tigers legend himself, took over the managerial role. The Kia Tigers cruised through the regular season, finishing first in the regular season and getting a direct bye to this Korean Series. And with no back-to-back Korean Series winners since the 2015-2016 Doosan Bears, the Tigers look to change that next season and defend their title. But for now, it's celebration time for the 12-time champions. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Today, cloudy skies continued across the country. In some Midwestern regions and on Jeju Island, there was some light rain in the earlier part of the day. From tomorrow, clear skies will be revealed nationwide again. For the time being, the daily temperature range is expected to be large. It's easy to catch a cold in these conditions, so please take care of your health. By tomorrow, storm winds of around 50 meters per second will blow around the southern coast and Jeju Island. You'd better check any items that could get blown away. Tomorrow, Chuncheon, Daejeon, and Daegu will start off at 10 degrees Celsius, Busan 14, Jeju 17 degrees. Highs will move up to 22 in Gwangju, Daegu, and Jeju, Busan 24 degrees. Autumn conditions will continue throughout this week around the country. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
요즘 한국에선 어떻게 노는지 알려줄까?
한국에선 아이돌이 되어볼 수도 인생 번호를 찾을 수도 있지.
제일 핫한 포토 스팟은 여기.
한국은 분명 너에게 새로운 영감을 줄 거야.
이런 한국, 와보지 않고는 모를걸? 진짜 한국에선 어떻게 먹는지 알려줄까?
K-바비큐? 신김치랑 먹어야지.
치킨? 치맥 페스티벌은 처음이지?
김치? 종류만큼 먹는 법도 가지각색.
김밥? 시장에선, 산에선, 바다에선 이렇게.
국밥?
취향 따라, 입맛 따라. 이런 한국, 와보지 않고는 모를걸?
How to survive in Korea. Cafes. Step 1. Find a seat. Before ordering, find a seat. Laptop ID, smartphone, jacket, whatever that can mark your territory. But no bites. It's a little too big. Step 2. Pick up. We do not ask or call your name. We call out, B69 고객님. The buzzer will vibrate when your order is ready at the counter. Wait, got your straw? Keep the top of the wrapper on. Doing this is more hygienic. Step 3. Cafe etiquette. If you need to use your laptop, find a seat next to a socket. No extra charge for using electricity. But if you're staying over 3 hours, how about ordering another drink or dessert? Step 4. Last bite standing. There's a mysterious custom in Korea. The last bite standing. When there's about 1 bite left of that cake, nobody will go for it. You might be tempted, but don't be hasty. Right before you get up, take the last piece saying that you simply can't waste food, or just leave it. It will save a few calories. Did you survive at the cafe? Did someone behind the counter catch your eye? Go for the same drink every single day.
오늘도 아이스 말차 라떼 드실 거죠?
You might make an impression.
생각했었지 기다릴게 피할 수 없을 데스티니 그렇게 사라지지 마 너에게 갔었지 난 한 번도 힘들지 않아 난 너가 볼 거야 넌 사랑으로 나를 안아줄래
and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Jong-un. Excitement and uncertainty fill the air as we're just a week away from a pivotal U.S. presidential election. Public interest is high, with recent reports showing a surge in early voting. Over 43 million Americans have already cast their ballots, setting a record for participation. Now, in the final stretch before the 2024 presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are concentrating on crucial battlegrounds, Michigan and Georgia. Harris rallied in Ann Arbor, emphasizing individual freedoms and reproductive rights, while Trump addressed Atlanta voters, attacking his opponents and encouraging them to vote on Election Day. For the rest of the week, both candidates are expected to travel across the country to make their last-minute sprint and win voters over. So now the big question is, will America get its first female president or a second Donald Trump reign? For answers to this, we're joined by our go-to VOA correspondent, Chris Casquejo. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be with you.
And also joining us is Peter K. Lee, Research Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Great to have you, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, let's start with you. The U.S. presidential election is just a week away, like I said, but various polls indicate that it's still quite difficult to predict the outcome.
That's correct. National polls show a tight race with just days to go, with Harris or Trump slightly ahead, but they're both within the margin of error. But most importantly, those battleground states that we always talk about also show a tight race, with basically a statistical tie in the 7 states that experts believe will determine the next president of the United States. We continue to make this point because the presidential election is a series of state-by-state contests, not a national popular vote, with the winning candidate needing to get 270 electoral votes.
Right. Now, with candidate support rates neck and neck in the polls, it seems like the battleground states will be key in deciding the winner, just as our Chris mentioned. So, Mr. Lee, why are these states extra important, and what are your projections for the situation in these states?
So I think, as Chris was mentioning, I mean, there are really 7 states at stake here. And it's such a close margin of error, within sort of 1%, I think, out of 6 or 7 of them. But I think, if we think back to the last presidential election, I mean, President Biden won with basically 44,000 votes out of Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. If you think back about 8 years ago to 2016, President Trump won that election with about 80,000 votes out of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So there's really, a tight margin of error out of an election of, so many million people. So I think that's where the swing states, and that's why so much presidential campaign effort and resources have been going to these states. I think that's really crucial to understand, particularly for Korean audiences, because of the electoral college system, which is very different to how elections are done elsewhere.
Right. So, Mr. Lee, is there a specific reason why these states are called swing states?
So I think, I mean, there's such a tight margin of error that, depending on the election, the voters in those states can go different ways. So if you think back almost 20 years ago or 24 years ago, if you think back to Al Gore and George Bush, Florida was a swing state back then. I mean, that over time, it's progressively become a more conservative state. So now it leans Republican. But at each U.S. presidential election, and even in the midterms, we see that the different states begin to vote in different ways, I think. So for this 2024 election, it's going to be these 7 states.
Right. Thank you for the explanation. Now, in terms of strategy, negative campaigning between Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican candidate Donald Trump is heating up. First, Chris, is this common in the U.S., this negative campaigning? And I wonder, how are American voters responding to these negative emotions?
Yes, it's very common because research has shown time and time again that it works. And there was a Trump rally on Sunday that was meant to serve as his closing message, but he's faced some backlash because of what many perceived as racist comments, including a comedian who called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, and those were comments that the Trump campaign later disavowed. And later today, VP Kamala Harris will give her closing arguments at the Ellipse, the same spot at the White House where Trump spoke on January 6, 2021, shortly before his supporters attacked the Capitol. Harris is expected to focus her remarks on the danger that Trump presents to U.S. democracy. She has stepped up her attacks, calling him a fascist in recent days, but she's expected to touch on broader themes tonight, driving home the stakes of the November 5th election for undecided voters who might be uncomfortable with Trump's divisive leadership and extreme rhetoric. And these are moderate Republicans who might be unwilling to vote for Trump again and might consider Harris. A lot of the voters who supported Nikki Haley in the primary process against Donald Trump.
Right, so this negative campaigning method is very common. Then why are the two candidates focusing more on these negative attacks instead of promoting their policies? Mr. Lee, how much more is this negative campaigning effective?
I think they are trying to sort of put forward their policy agenda in the midst of this negative campaigning. I think it's worth thinking back even, about 2 months ago to after the presidential assassination attempt on President Trump. We think about that, at the Republican National Congress, where he was talking about, bringing unity, right? And he was taking a very different approach. And he was saying things like, the discord and division in our society must be healed. But there was that brief moment, I think, where they were trying to get beyond the negative campaigning. And much like Vice President Kamala Harris, when she took over the Democratic nomination, she tried to sort of, channel some of that Obama-era, optimism, hope, and unity. So I think, there was that opportunity to have a very different kind of campaign, but I think both sides have really reverted back to their, standard modus operandi, I think. And I think that's partly a reflection of, the high stakes in this election. Both sides have made this out that if they lose, it's the end of the world, really. And I think that has really driven some of this vitriol, some of this extreme rhetoric on both sides.
Right. So this negative campaigning method is quite effective, I guess. That's why they're both focusing on that.
I think it's really about trying to drive turnout, right? You were mentioning at the opening that many millions of Americans have already started to vote with only a week left. It's really about getting those last few people who might have made up their mind but might not go to the ballot box on election day. It's really about to get those people passionate and riled up to go vote next week.
Right, and I'm guessing social media would play a big role in this negative campaigning, effectiveness of this negative campaigning, right?
Absolutely, and I think in the midst of that, we have fake news, misinformation, and everything designed to really tap people's impulses to get them really passionate about these issues, even with the wrong information, I think, and that's really the dangerous component.
Right. Now, as Mr. Lee just pointed out, the number of early voters for the U.S. presidential election reached a record high in several states. Now, what does this high early voting rate indicate, and which candidate might benefit from this, Chris?
Yeah, at last check, more than 46 million voters have already voted in this election. Now, usually Democrats have an advantage in early voting, but so far, at least, Republicans are taking part in a much higher rate than they normally do. Trump, for his part, for years has encouraged his supporters to cast only in-person ballots, but he has backed off on that in recent months as he and the GOP have acknowledged the obvious benefit of banking votes early. Because of Republican participation, the early turnout was breaking records last week in the swing states of North Carolina and Georgia. But the GOP has really focused more on election integrity and questioning whether elections are secure rather than a traditional get out the vote operation, which the Democrats have invested billions in. So it's unclear whether the uptick in Republican early voting will continue and which candidate it will help, because obviously you can figure out which party is voting early, but that still doesn't account for people who might be Republicans but crossing over to vote for Democrat Kamala Harris or Democrats who might be voting for Donald Trump. Yeah, it probably is a rare case, but there is always that possibility in either case.
Right, so we'll have to wait and see until the rest of the week which direction the votes will go. Now, Chris, one of the biggest issues these days is North Korean troops reportedly being deployed to Russia to participate in its war with Ukraine. And some say this could act as a variable in the U.S. election. How is public opinion analyzing this?
Yeah, well, it's important to note that the most important issues are still the economy, immigration, and abortion. So U.S. elections aren't really decided on foreign policy, but they just present a general picture of the candidate who might be taking the office in the White House. On Joe Rogan's podcast, Trump repeated concerns that the enemy from within the country poses a more dangerous threat than foreign governments. And this time he was talking about his relationship with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Trump said, "I got along great with him." Trump was the first president ever to set foot inside North Korea. Now, VP Harris has vowed to continue America's global leadership if elected, raising expectations that she's going to forge ahead with Biden's policy of centering a U.S. network of allies and partners to confront shared challenges, including North Korea's threats and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. During her nomination speech in August, she said she will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump, remarks that indicate she would carry out a conventional diplomatic approach with states like North Korea rather than seeking direct diplomacy with the North Korean ruler. So it's more of a continuation of Biden's foreign policy and shoring up alliances in the region, whereas many analysts say that Donald Trump is more of a wild card in this case.
Now, like Chris just pointed out, former President Donald Trump mentioned North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un again during a podcast on the 25th. He said he got to know Kim Jong-un better than anybody. Mr. Lee, what is Trump's intention behind mentioning the North's leader?
So I guess before getting to sort of Donald Trump's views of Kim Jong-un, I mean, going back to Chris's discussion just there about the North Korean dispatch of troops to Ukraine, this marks an unprecedented escalation on the part of North Korea. And I think for many U.S. allies, there are going to be serious questions around U.S. deterrence and whether it has actually succeeded in stopping this alignment that we see taking place, right? It's been a very piecemeal, provocations over time for the last 2 years in terms of North Korea's intervention into Ukraine. And really the question is, has the U.S. been able to stop that, to deter that, and to punish or respond to that kind of escalation? So I think that therein is the question around how U.S. allies are looking at this, but also domestically in the U.S., right? The question about has U.S. leadership under the Biden and Harris administration been effective at stopping coercion and provocations by regimes like North Korea, Russia, China, and Iran? I think that's really where the debate is. But as Chris was saying, it's going to be largely for domestic issues. Now, going back to your point about President Trump's, romance with Kim Jong-un, and he's sort of returning to that theme, I think there are at least 2 reasons for that. I think the first is really that we've seen over the last 8 years that President Trump ascribes to this sort of great man theory of history. That, all of international affairs is essentially, distilled into the works of great men, such as himself, obviously. So I think he looks at the North Korea-US sort of example as, an illustration of how he has been able to overcome, bureaucratic forces, economic forces, the intricacies of government, and to really just deal with a leader, as he always did in business. So I think that's where he comes at that issue. The second part, I think, is really that he looks at the history of U.S. dealing with North Korea under his administration as a success story. And he sort of tries to contrast that with what he argues is the weak or incompetent or ineffective approach of the Biden administration. So I think that's where he's trying to show that the contrast between how he has dealt with strong and tough and challenging dictators and strongmen, and that he's actually quite at ease with that compared to the Biden-Harris administration.
Right, so he's kind of showing off his confidence in resolving these kinds of conflicts, especially with his former relations with Chairman Kim. Now, given the tight race, some people speculate that it would be difficult to determine the winner even on election night. So, Chris, how did past elections unfold during similar neck-and-neck situations?
Well, the 2000 election outcome was not decided until 5 weeks after Election Day. A few hundred votes separated the candidates in Florida, and that brought out a bunch of lawsuits and recounts in full force, including disputes about confusing or improperly punched ballots, missing names on voter rolls, and multiple requests for ID for minority voters. 5 weeks after the election, the U.S. Supreme Court had the final word, ruling by a narrow majority to stop the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court on the grounds that it violated the constitutional principle that all votes must be treated equally. George W. Bush, who won 30 states, counting Florida, maintained a razor-thin 5-vote majority in the Electoral College, and he was the first candidate in 112 years to win the presidency without winning the popular vote. Al Gore actually got more than 500,000 votes in the popular vote that year, but by a slim majority of 537 votes in Florida, which was then a battleground state, as we've discussed, Bush prevailed in the Electoral College. And it's important to note that certain states, including Pennsylvania, which has the largest number of electoral votes at stake in the so-called battleground states, cannot start counting its absentee or mail-in ballots until Election Day, and that's particularly going to be an issue in large metropolitan areas with large populations like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the biggest population centers in that battleground state.
Right, so we won't be able to, we're most likely not going to be able to know the results on that day, on Election Day, right?
Correct, that's what a lot of experts predict, but of course, we're already in the presidential race, so it's a matter of how turnout does against the polls, because polls are a snapshot in time. This election right now is about which voters are turning out for which candidate.
Right, of course. Now, amid these various concerns about recounts, potential lawsuits, what are the last-minute scenarios and variables that could decide the outcome of the two candidates, Mr. Lee?
I mean, so U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld once talked about unknown unknowns, right? The things that we don't know, that we don't even know we don't know. So I think, if you look back at this presidential race over the last few months, there's been things that nobody could have imagined happening, right? 6 months ago, everybody thought this would be President Biden versus former President Trump. 3-4 months ago, nobody would have expected that President Biden would drop out. Nobody would have expected 2 assassination attempts, right? So many things have happened in the last few months that I think few people could have imagined that even the next 7 days, it's all bets are off, I think, in terms of what could happen.
Right. So it really depends on how things will unfold. What about Chris? What kind of variables do you think could shake in the results?
I want to take you back to 2016 when then FBI Director James Comey released a letter to Congress that federal investigators had learned of new emails pertinent into the investigation into Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server when she was Secretary of State. Now, he sent that letter on October 28th of 2016. So I would say that it wouldn't be a surprise to expect a late October surprise with just a few days left, or even an early November surprise. And it could be that this backlash over the comments at the Madison Square Garden rally are part of that, because we've seen a lot of Puerto Rican artists like Bad Bunny, Jennifer Lopez, Mark Anthony mobilize on social media, and that could be crucial in a battleground state like Pennsylvania with a large Puerto Rican population. So we'll have to see if that might be the October surprise, because a lot of Democratic analysts say that this is taking off in a way that some of Donald Trump's more offensive comments have not taken off. And this wasn't even Donald Trump. It was a comedian who was introducing him or, setting the stage for him at this rally. But the backlash has been intense, and it's now in its second or third day.
Right, so we'll have to see if there will be another October surprise that will surprise us or not. Now, as for South Korea, depending on which candidate wins, there could be significant implications for U.S.-South Korea relations and U.S.-North Korea relations as well. What should South Korea prioritize to prepare for different election outcome scenarios, Mr. Lee?
So I think, fundamentally, if Vice President Harris were to win the election on November 5th, credit where credit is due. So the Biden administration has done a lot of work to improve the ROK-US alliance in the last 4 years. So I think we're going to expect to see that further continue under a Harris administration. But I think they're really going to be working towards how to optimize the ROK-US alliance to deal with this unprecedented challenge by North Korea in Russia and their collaboration. In terms of how the Harris administration would deal with North Korea, I think we can expect a lot of the status quo to be continued, but also, sort of this developing of unilateral partnerships. So we had, for instance, recently the multinational sanctions monitoring team. So basically the United States and some of its key allies and partners, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and others, come together in the absence of the UN Security Council panel of experts being disbanded by Russia. So I think we're going to see that effort continue. Now, really, the real question, I guess, for South Korea and other U.S. allies is if President Trump wins. And so I think we will obviously expect a massive crisis in cost-sharing negotiations. President Trump has been very clear that he does not think the current arrangement is satisfactory. On the campaign trail, he's talked about $5 billion, even $10 billion in terms of special measures agreement renegotiations. So there's going to be a very big demand coming, and I think South Korea is going to get ready for that, but also other U.S. allies. In terms of how President Trump will deal with North Korea, and going back to our discussion earlier, it really depends on whether Kim Jong-un approaches him with flattery or with, fire and fury and more nuclear, threats. So I think that will really depend, but that will shape and take place within what Russia and China are already doing. So it's not going to be happening in a vacuum, I think, but there's certainly a lot of worried people, I think.
All right. Thank you for providing a potential clear picture of the future situations. I'm afraid we'll have to end it just right here. Mr. Lee and Chris, thank you so much for your insights and time tonight. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.
How to survive in Korea. Workplace. Step 1.